But your gut is actually doing things. The bacteria have DNA, which encode genes, which encode enzymes. Your bacteria are actually performing functions in your gut themselves. If you don't have an environment where those microbes can thrive, you're not really getting the benefit of your probiotic, which is where synbiotics come into play. Your gut is talking to the rest of your body. The vagus nerve, traveling from the gut to the brain, 80 to 90% one-way communication from the gut to the brain. It basically acts as a megaphone.
So something that comes up constantly, questions I hear all the time, is around probiotics, and specifically this concept of what is the best probiotic, which is an impossible question to answer when you think about all the different strains, the goals. Is it for your gut? Is it for your brain? Is it for longevity? We need to understand this better. So this is where I think we should spend a little bit more time today.
Yeah, no, 100%. One of the most common questions I get from people is, hey, I want to improve my gut health. What do I take? And it's such a broad question, but it's also an exciting one because the research has really picked up over the last couple of years, especially when it comes to different types of biotics. So I think it's important to start with what the difference is between a prebiotic, a probiotic, a postbiotic, and a synbiotic, because those are labels you see pretty commonly now all over the supplement aisle. So to put it kind of in the most baseline form, a prebiotic is the food that feeds your gut microbes. So in order to be considered a prebiotic, it actually has to only feed the good microbes. So it's not just any type of fiber, any type of starch. It's specifically ones that target kind of those beneficial bacteria.
Oh, give me an example there, because anytime I think about prebiotics, I just hear fiber. It's like, they almost feel correlated one-to-one these days. So let's break that down a little further.
Yeah, so inulin is a very popular one that people take. Psyllium husk, green bananas, asparagus. Generally when we think of fruits and vegetables, a lot of them are going to be prebiotic, especially if they're ones that you really have to chew to be able to swallow them. So that's kind of a good mental check of whether something has a lot of fiber. And then when we move into probiotics, what we're doing there is actually seeding our gut with the beneficial microbes themselves. And so something that's interesting about that is that if you don't have an environment where those microbes can thrive, you're not really getting the benefit of your probiotic, which is where synbiotics come into play, which have the prebiotics that feed those specific microbes, and then the probiotics that can then flourish in the gut. So you can think about it as both the seed and the fertilizer when you take those types of supplements.
So if we don't have the gut health in place, if we don't have the microbes in place beforehand, a probiotic isn't actually going to be helpful at all.
Right. Which is really interesting because it's actually the entire environment you have to think of. Because the microbes in your gut, the bacteria, can do something called horizontal gene transfer, which means that when you have a lot of diversity, even if something wipes out specific microbes, your bacteria can kind of compensate and help you maintain that balance. But if you do things like you don't eat enough diversity in food, if you take antibiotics consistently, if you have ongoing chronic stress, things like that can really deplete specific bacteria in your gut in a way that your gut can no longer compensate. So you can't really maintain that balance, which is where we start to see those downstream effects.
So we have prebiotic, we have probiotic, we have synbiotic, but then we have this thing called
the postbiotic.
So help us understand that a little bit too.
Yeah, so the postbiotic is very exciting because it's a newer kind of area of supplementation, and it's a really creative one, I think. So your bacteria, or the bacteria in your gut, produce things. So they produce these byproducts that your body can then use to, digest fiber, to regulate your mood, to reduce inflammation, things like that. And so what happens when we don't have enough bacterial diversity, or we don't have the right environment, is our body can't produce those beneficial byproducts. And there's another layer where some people, even if they're eating the beneficial prebiotic foods, they don't have enzymes needed to effectively convert them into those beneficial byproducts. So postbiotics essentially bypass that step. It's feeding your body directly those beneficial compounds, byproducts that it can then use to do things like recycle damaged cells, regulate your mood, potentially reduce things like anxiety, and so on. And so there's a lot of research right now on how supplementing those compounds directly might be able to improve health over time.
And do I need all of these things for it to be effective? Can I just take one?
Yeah, so I would say the most studied combination right now is a synbiotic, which is going to be providing a very studied strain of probiotic, which I think we should touch on a little bit, is why strain is important, and then the food to kind of help your body maintain that organism in your body. And so I think for most people, a good place to start is a well-studied probiotic that sort of has a few different strains with studied effects for gut health, potentially cardiovascular health, and then potentially mood regulation, just as sort of a general baseline to make sure that they're keeping their gut in a good place. I'd say that that's important these days because a lot of people don't hit 30 different fruits and vegetables per week.
Guilty.
Yeah, which is what's considered kind of that baseline for maintaining healthy diversity. So if you don't feel like you're consistently eating a very diverse diet, then a probiotic and a prebiotic together is a good place to start to sort of have that protection over time.
Interesting. And so there's another concept I want to talk about, because one of the things I hear about prebiotics a lot is that they're transient. So going to the concept that a prebiotic is going to temporarily increase the gut microbiome, the bacteria in the gut microbiome, but it's not going to be a permanent fix. Essentially, it's only going to last while you're taking the prebiotic or the probiotic, and then once you're done taking it, it's going to kind of like go back to baseline.
Yeah. So I think something that is both good and bad about the gut is how variable it is, like how quickly it changes. So it unfortunately is one of those things that if you are eating prebiotic fiber and having your probiotics for a couple of weeks and then you stop, that's not going to be a lifelong effect. It is something that requires ongoing maintenance to sort of maintain that bacterial community. However, there is emerging evidence that some things earlier in life are harder to change. So your gut is extremely diverse. So there's actually 100 trillion bacteria in the gut, which is more cells than there are in the human body. And one of the things that I think a lot of people don't know about their gut is that the bacteria have DNA, which encode genes, which encode enzymes. And so what's happening is your bacteria are actually performing functions in your gut themselves. And this could be related to, building precursors that your brain uses to regulate your mood. It could be helping to tamper down inflammation in the body. It could be even to just help digest food at a healthy regularity and improve your digestive health. But your gut is actually doing things. And so when you're feeding it the right type of prebiotic fiber and you have kind of a good balance of diversity within your body, it actually affects your entire system, not just your digestive tract, which is why new areas are coming out like psychobiotics, gerobiotics, and different types of probiotics or prebiotics that are specific to different functions in your body.
I want to take a quick step back and talk about the technical definition of a probiotic, which is live microorganisms that, when conferred in adequate amounts, have a healthy effect on the body. And there's a couple of different pieces there, because they have to be alive. And we can't promise that probiotics, when you're buying them off a shelf, are actually going to be alive. They don't have a strong shelf life, especially if they've been exposed to heat or other elements. They have to be provided in an adequate amount, which requires proper testing and proper studying. And they actually have to confer a positive effect. And so I want to spend some time there, because that's a pretty broad definition. And probiotics do a lot of different things. I think we think about them just as part of our gut, part of our digestive health. But there are so many other areas in which probiotics can provide benefit. And so let's talk about that a little more as well.
Yeah, and so I like what you touched on sort of those three components that are required for something to be defined as a probiotic. And I think something that's important to touch on is the first one of those is that there's a strain definition. And so a lot of times on a label, you'll see some fancy word that you don't understand and you think, okay, this must be what I'm looking for. This looks like the name of a probiotic. That's fine. But a lot of research is done in strains specifically. And so when you're seeing, you want to see basically a 3-part word. And that first part is going to be the genus, the second part's the species, and the third part is the strain itself. And so that tells you more specifically what's happening in the body. And so the other part you touched on, that it needs to have a demonstrated health effect, that strain is typically what's studied for that health effect. And that strain is going to help you understand what type of enzyme it encodes, what type of function is happening in the gut, and how that might affect other parts of your body.
And the third part of that is they have to be alive when you're administering them, which leads us to another really interesting concept, because you see this concept of CFUs and AFUs and billions and billions and billions of bacteria that you're getting in your body. But how do we even know if they're alive for that much? And so can you help us understand CFU versus AFU, and is 10 billion versus 50 billion better? How do we understand this?
Yeah, so CFU stands for colony forming unit. And this is typically a measure of kind of the potency of that probiotic. So it's at the time of manufacturing, how many of these kind of colony forming units do we have in the probiotic? And that can be a lot different than what's actually being delivered to your gut in your system. First, it's the transport when it comes from manufacturing to when you're actually taking the probiotic. Is it being stored well? Is it being manufactured in a way that it can maintain kind of that travel, that shelf life? When's the expiration date? Things like that. And the second piece of it is it being degraded in digestion before it reaches the gut and kind of that end destination for colonization? So is it being delivered in a way that's resistant to stomach acid, resistant to those small intestine bile salt acids, things like that? The second piece is AFU, and this is a newer unit that we're seeing more. It stands for active fluorescence units. And this basically is counting cell membrane. So it's often a much higher number because it's not only looking at those colony forming units.
Got it. And from what I understand, AFUs can have, just because it's not counting just live bacteria, it's counting other components, broken down bacteria as well, that can theoretically, I think the science is still emerging, but theoretically provide beneficial effects to the body, even if they're not that live bacteria itself, which I think is an interesting concept, but I'm looking forward to seeing how that research evolves and what that ultimately plays out when it comes to biological effects.
Absolutely. And I think that's where postbiotics are starting to come into play too, because postbiotics are not live organisms. And so there's a lot of focus from, different companies right now of saying probiotics, because they're live organisms, it's much more difficult to sort of maintain stability, make sure that they're being delivered effectively to the right place. Whereas when you're dealing with non-live organisms or things like cell fragments, different compounds, the potential for delivery is maybe an easier problem to solve, but it's something that's coming out in the research right now, and that I'm very excited to see.
I am too. So let's talk about use case a little bit. When I think about probiotics, or when people traditionally think about probiotics, it's always been gut health, gut health, gut health, gut health. Maybe I want to improve my digestion. Maybe I have IBS, Crohn, whatever it could be. But it goes so much further than that. Yeah. We're seeing a lot when it comes to cardiovascular health. We're seeing things like the estrobolome. We are even seeing it tied to brain health. Talk to me more about how we think about probiotics in a larger holistic scope versus just the digestive tract alone.
Yeah, so your gut is talking to the rest of your body. And one piece of imagery that really has stuck with me over time is that the vagus nerve traveling from the gut to the brain, it's almost 80 to 90% one-way communication from the gut to the brain. It basically acts as a megaphone. And so what's happening is in the gut, when your bacteria are producing different molecules, different enzymes, things like that, a lot of times the receptors on your gut lining will sort of see what's being produced and send this signal to your brain that then modulates different type of chemical production there, which can affect your mood, it can affect your reaction to stress, it can react a whole kind of host of biological processes that we're just beginning to understand. I think another piece when it comes to female health is not only is your gut acting as this megaphone, but it's directly metabolizing estrogen, which is something that gets talked about a lot in female health. One, because of oral contraceptives often have synthetic estrogens, which kind of affects this metabolic process, but also because in perimenopause and menopause, estrogen metabolism becomes a lot more variable, and estrogen production tends to fluctuate and then decline. So how we metabolize and how the body reabsorbs estrogen has, this cascading effect often on how a woman feels. So the gut's becoming this piece that people are paying a lot more attention to on how it might be able to help kind of modulate that process.
So with all this information, we talk about prebiotic, probiotic, synbiotic, postbiotic. If I'm imagining here saying like, okay, now what do I do with all this information, right? And like, how do I buy the right thing, et cetera? One thing that comes to my mind a lot is like, food first is not a bad way to go. You think about all these fermented foods that you have in the store. You think about yogurt, you think about sauerkraut, you think of all these different cultured or fermented foods that you have. Now, a pickle is not going to do it. You can't just go eat the pickle and cause it. You actually have to have these properly cultured, properly fermented foods. But if I want to go a step further, if I'm looking to purchase that probiotic off a shelf, what do I need to be thinking about?
I think a good place to start is thinking about, feeding what you already have. So making sure that prebiotics are a consistent part of your diet. Because no matter what you do to sort of repopulate your gut, if you're not providing that fertilizer, you're not going to maintain over time. You're not going to basically help the beneficial bacteria flourish and maybe reduce proportions of the non-beneficial ones.
See, I love that too, because it's never bad to recommend fiber. Nobody's getting enough fiber. That's kind of like a nice little bonus that you get on top of the prebiotic. Like that's like the cherry on top of the prebiotic cake.
Yeah. And I think it's fun too when you start to try to add a little more diversity. It gives you a little push to buy, a fruit you might not have before, a new type of vegetable that you want to try a recipe with, things like that. I actually think one of the most successful public health campaigns of all time is in the UK called 5 a Day. And you see it everywhere in the grocery stores on different labels this is 3 of your 5, this is 4 of your 5. And the goal is 5 different fruits and vegetables every single day. And I think it's a good way to start gamifying it a little bit and think, what did I have for lunch? I'm going to try to have something different for dinner, or like a different fruit with dessert, and things like that. I also think something that's important when it comes to probiotics themselves is getting comfortable with complicated names that you can't read. I think there's a big focus right now on, don't buy anything on the label that you don't understand or you don't know what that word is and things like that. And when I started studying the microbiome a few years ago, I had to get really comfortable really quickly with words that looked complicated, I wasn't sure how to pronounce, and sort of made me feel a little bit overwhelmed at first. But when it comes to probiotic, strain does matter. There are a lot of supplements we take that are more for general health. Probiotics, I think, in my opinion, are often most effectively used for a specific goal. So let's say you're taking an antibiotic and you want to match the strain to, research that is helping your gut kind of withstand that stress. Or maybe if you're going through a hormonal transition as a woman, there's specific research with strains that, have been shown to see some beneficial associations there, and you want to match that strain for your health goal. So I think it can be kind of fun to think about, because the gut is constantly changing and the microbiome is constantly evolving, you can kind of map to goals over time, which I think is a very important part of personalizing that health routine for you.
Well, I think that's a good rule of thumb for supplements across the board. Like, I feel like far too often we start with like, I like the idea of this supplement, I'm going to take it. When instead we should really be thinking about, I want to achieve this goal. Let me figure out the right thing for that. And I would imagine it's rarely what I chose in the beginning if I'm moving back to the goal itself. And it seems like that's just the same for probiotics.
Yeah. And I think it's one of those things that because there is such a big market and there's a lot of noise, people get overwhelmed. But it's like anything else in your life where, you tend to shift your exercise routine over time depending on what feels good. You tend to shift, what your meals might look like depending on kind of what's speaking to you at that time. And it can be the same with supplements you take. Over time, you might make small tweaks and small shifts depending on what your goal is, during that era of your life. And I think it's kind of important to reframe in your brain instead of a one and done, I've built my stack, it's going to be like this for the next 50 years, is to think of it as this ongoing process that, is responding to how you might be feeling.
So I think this is great. And I think we can kind of start to close up here in the sense that, like, I think most people just generally think of probiotics as I can take any probiotic to fix digestive health. And clearly it goes so much more broader than that. And being able to understand that conceptually and be able to work backwards from the goal, it's just a fantastic place for people to start here.
I completely agree.
So final question here. I'm in the store. I'm looking at that probiotic. How do I know which one to choose? What am I looking for in making that decision?
Yeah, so great question, very important one. I think you can go by a 3-step process here. The first and the most important is that you're taking a strain that matches your goal. So before anything else, you should know what you're looking for on the label. The second is going to be the CFU. You want to make sure that it's high enough that it's going to be an effective dose. The third part is that it's going to be delivered effectively to your gut, to that end destination. So the label might not tell you that it has an enteric coating or, give you the specifics you need to make that judgment for yourself. So looking for a brand with a high trust score on Subco can kind of give you that peace of mind that you're dealing with a brand that has the manufacturing standards and the expertise behind it, that they're making sure that their supplement is going to deliver effectively within your body, kind of as much as they can.
Perfect. Now I know how to buy my probiotics.